At this time, we will discuss identification profiles. This is one of the more important WSA policies, which is generally used for classification of our transactions traversing through the proxy. And the concept of a profile is going to be enforced for two main purposes. One is going to be to just group the transactions based on some sort of common classification criteria, like maybe IP addresses of my clients, a subnet where transactions originate from. I can specify that this is only for certain protocols like clear text versus encrypted web. I can choose a port number. I can use a user agent string, which is what identifies the application sending packets, and I can specify a URL category. So we have several different options, several conditions, what we can use to group the transactions, where the goal here is going to be just simplification of our access policy, because as we will see in our later session, our access policies will be able to use identification profiles as one of their conditions. For instance, if I build two policies, access policy 1 and access policy 2, I can refer to an identification profile from within that policy. Like I will have my identification profile 1 over here and another profile over there. So if I say that inside of my identification profile, it is supposed to catch connections from LAN 1 versus this profile is supposed to match transactions coming from a different subnet, it immediately means that those sessions will be subject to this policy versus those transactions will be processed by another policy, or each of those policies, again, as we will see in the next session, can be potentially configured with different settings, different control settings, what allows us to come up with different policies for those users. I can even build an identity profile for my guests to restrict access to most of the websites. I can have one for admins, I can have one for HR, one for finance, and so on. So this way we will simplify our access policies because we don't really have to build policies for each of the transactions. We will group transactions based on common criteria, but in the same time we will also keep our access policy pretty granular by using different policies for different profiles. And now the second thing why you would actually want to use identification profiles is going to be to control authentication. Authentication is going to be very important for the WSA because it enhances visibility. It allows you to see exactly who originated a transaction, like what user on what station. Plus, the authentication credentials can be also used as part of your conditions inside of access policies. So this way I can not only build my policies based on IP addresses, based on protocols, port, and so on, I can also build custom policies for individual users or at least groups of users. Now, as a side note here, it is not actually recommended to build per user policies because they can severely degrade performance of the proxy, but you can at least group those users, like rely on the Active Directory information, group information, use this stuff in the policies. Identification profiles are one of those elements that are evaluated first for each of the new transactions traversing through the proxy. In our next session, I'm going to show you that the first thing that actually happens for a new connection is going to be a bypass lookup. Like we have the option to bypass WSA for transactions based on addresses of the clients, for example. So this is going to be the first thing, but assuming that the transaction is not on the bypass list, is not part of our bypass policy, identification profiles will be evaluated next. So something you want to pay attention to, this stuff goes before access policies. And that actually makes a lot of sense because, as I said, you can use the profiles as one of the access policies conditions. Now, the profiles inside of the profile table will be evaluated like an access list. It is going to be the top-down approach where we will stop evaluating further policies on a match. So when I have a match, I stop the evaluation and I'm looking at my policies from the top towards the bottom. So I start with 1. If I don't have a match, I go to 2. No match here. I go down to 3. I have a match here. I'm not looking at anything else. I just enforce the profile and then process the transaction with other settings. As I mentioned previously, there are going to be several types of conditions we can use inside of a profile. When you use more than one condition, it is going to be the AND logic, what the WSA will apply during the evaluation. So for instance, when you say use HTTP and somewhere else you will say that this is for IP subnet, let's say 10.1.1.0/24. The transaction is only going to match the profile if it is clear text HTTP coming from this source. And you will also have an equivalent of the implicit access list deny, which in case of identification profiles is just known as a global profile. This is acting as a catch-all for each of the transactions that didn't match our custom profile. Well, in this case, we will not be blocking anything. The role of the global profile is to say that we don't want to perform authentication on the session. So global identification profile is acting just like a tag for a session. It doesn't enable authentication. Now, inside of an identification profile, you will have several ways of enabling authentication. We have several types of authentication methods available on the proxy. The regular authentication is all about defining a reel, like when you build or specify an Active Directory server, or maybe you have a LDAP server. You do the integration with the server and then use this to authenticate. So this means that the communication will be generally redirected to the proxy so that the user can authenticate. Then we can use a transparent authentication where the user will not be prompted to authenticate because the authentication data is going to be fetched from the Identity Services Engine or maybe from the ASA if you are using remote access VPNs, or finally from the AD server through the so-called software agent. So in this last case, you will have to install the agent and configure the WSA to use it. So the device is going to be fetching the authentication credentials in the background, and the user will not have to specify the credentials to access the website. We can also specify that authentication will be disabled. So exemption, this is by default enabled in the global profile. And this is going to be needed for certain applications that don't support authentication. Now think about stuff like Windows updates or maybe Google updates. Those applications, they are not HTTP aware and they are not capable of providing authentication credentials to the proxy. And because of that, you always have to exempt those clients from the authentication process. And the last option is going to be to tell WSA how you want to handle failed authentications. So this is basically an equivalent of the Identity Services Engine guest access feature, where you build a profile where you enable a guest privileges, and then in the access policy table, you add a policy that will match this profile to provide restricted access for your guest users, contractors, or any other type of temporary users you might see in the network. Okay, one additional concept that is related to authentication on the WSA is known as surrogates for authentication, which is what controls the way of tracking the identity information by the proxy. And what do I mean by this is that once the WSA obtains credentials for a user, it will have to somehow store this information, remember this information, so the user is not prompted to re-authenticate every single time it accesses a different website. And now the way that WSA accomplishes this is going to be by either binding the authentication credentials to the IP address, which is a recommended surrogate to use, or you can also use the cookie-based approach, in which case it is going to be the server what sends a cookie to the client to tell it what's its username, and then when the browser sends some more packets, it is going to include the cookie in the transaction. So the recommended way is going to be to use IP address method. I'm going to say that my user goes to cisco.com, and we will say that authentication for this transaction is enabled. So we have a match with an identification profile, authentication was turned on, and this is not a transparent authentication. What is going to happen here is that before a packet is actually sent to cisco.com, it is going to be first delivered to the WSA, and WSA will redirect the session to itself. It will display authentication website, and then, assuming that authentication is successful, it is going to contain a binding between the authentication credentials and IP address of our user. So of course the assumption is that our user uses a PC configured with this IP address. And when it sees subsequent packets from this IP address to other websites, just based on the IP address, it is going to know that the connections are coming from the authenticated user. So stuff like this, we will see this in the log messages, and this information is going to be taken into account when enforcing our policies. Okay, in order to configure the profiles, you will have to go to the Web Security Manager and then choose Identification Profiles option. This is how you will get to the profile table. But before you will be able to configure all of the profile options, you will first have to define a realm under network and authentication, and possibly tune some of the global settings. Right, let's now quickly take a look at identification profile config. I'm gonna go to the network and authentication tab, and just to quickly show you how to add a realm, because this is really where you would normally start when you want to deploy authentication. So most people, what they will do is that they will use Active Directory. I'm gonna click on authentication realms, add a realm, and then we will also get back and discuss the global setting for a moment. So you would normally give it a name. You would choose the server type, like for AD, you would use this option, Active Directory. You would give it an IP address, and you would specify the AD account details. And this is supposed to be an account that is capable of creating machine accounts on the AD server itself. And as a side note here, notice that those question marks that are available for many of the GUI options, they are pretty useful. They tell you in many cases what exactly you're supposed to do and how you should accomplish this. So the admin account that you will put here must have the rights of building those machine accounts on the AD server. Again, Active Directory agent settings, this is needed if you want to use transparent authentication with AD. And then this section is how you can test your configuration. Like, is your DNS properly configured? Is your time in sync between the WSA and the AD, and so on? If this output tells you that everything is fine, you can then join domain, and the realm is going to show up in the authentication realm section. But I will not be adding a realm because my Active Directory server is not properly defined. So we will just go back to the global settings and take a look at those. And we will then build a simple identification profile. So just a couple options you can set here. Like, what do you do if authentication server is unavailable? Do you want to allow communication without authentication? Or maybe do you want to block the traffic? Now, how about if authentication fails? How do you want to log the transactions? Okay, this is for reauthentication. Okay, this is what you could use to perform encryption on the credentials during authentication, especially used for basic authentication schemes. And this option, redirect hostname, this is pretty important because this is how you specify a website. Notice that this is by default the WSA's data port. The user is going to be redirected to authenticate. So if you had a AD server defined and the profile is configured for authentication, the user will be normally at some point redirected to the WSA to authenticate, assuming of course that you are not using transparent authentication. And this option would control exactly what interface of the WSA would be used to terminate the authentication session. You can also specify the caching staff, timeouts, and possibly upload a certificate for encryption, like if you plan to use encryption during authentication. Okay, in our case, what we will do is that we will build an identification profile, but the profile is going to be actually exempting, bypassing authentication. So this is going to be an equivalent of the global identification profile. Let's just go to a Web Security Manager, identification profiles. As I explained previously, the default profile is always here. It acts as a catch-all, and its role is to actually disable authentication. It's like authentication is by default turned off. This is the purpose of the global identification profile, exempt from authentication. Now, the reason that I want to put my own is that we will be able to verify this in the logs. So the only change from authentication is going to be that we will not see a username, but we will still see the profile that was matched for a transaction and its name. I'm going to call it LAN clients, and I will define member by subnets. This is going to be one of the two conditions. The other conditions that I will use here is going to be to tell it that this is for web communication, encrypted or not. And based on our topology, I'm going to specify this subnet as my LAN. So all connections leaving this network, web connections, should match my custom identification profile. Okay, /24, and not in the description, in the define members by subnet section. And then let's take a look at advanced. Some other options I could potentially use. This would be port number, URL categories, and user agents. Okay, if I defined a realm, we would also have an option to choose the realm and select authentication type. In my case, it's going to be an exemption. So what we should see now is that this profile is going to be placed above the global one. And remember that identification profiles, or just identification profile table, I should say, the same as the access policy table, is evaluated top-down. So this entry is going to be checked first before the catch-all entry. When we go to the PC and reconnect to this website, and then take a look at the log output on the proxy, Let me just clear this output. Let's wait for the second transaction. Maybe let's also connect once again. Okay, my expectation now is going to be to see some other transactions. Okay, this one actually shows me what we saw in the previous session because I forgot to commit those changes. So we see that they don't take effect unless we commit. And the reason I can tell you that they are not in place is that we still see unknowns in the bottom section of the log. So one of those should change to the name of our identification profile. This is what they want to show you in this session. It's like they want to make sure that they have a match in a custom profile I just defined. Okay, this is now in place. We're going to refresh, and I will also say www.facebook.com. This website is emulated by Router 4. Which is here. Okay, we go back to the logs. Okay, I got the login prompt, which is good. We just need to wait for the log to show up. And I'll notice what's different here. Like if we take a look at this transaction, for instance, and we compare this transaction to that one. It's all about this output here, LAN clients. So it still shows me the website category. This is more of like URL filtering stuff. It shows me the score, reputation, and this says that I'm using a custom identification profile called LAN clients.